In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I cast thee out, unclean spirit. Oh, leave these innocent souls alone. Torment them no more, you foul demon. You vile thing have no right to possess these poor people. I send you back to hell from which you came from. I cast you out from Neil McRobert. I cast thee out from Emily Hughes. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Fearmongers, I am your host, Clay McLeod Chapman. It is our final episode of Fearmongers for 20 fucking 24. I think I've already earned the explicit demarcation for this episode, so apologies,
I
sensitive
think we've all
listener.
earned it by now.
I think we're just gonna get it like tattooed to our biceps. We all need the E, the explicit. Um, Guys, joining me tonight, we have some amazing guests. It didn't take long to kind of think about who to wrap 2024 up, and I really truly wanted to find uh, the people who I admire a lot, considering the fact that I feel like so much of what has made this year sustainable, I guess, is community. And I think of a lot of selfless acts and things that seem to be done for some altruistic reason that goes beyond fame and fortune and money and all the things that people seem to aspire to. And that's why I wanted to invite Emily C. Hughes, author of Horror for Weenies, which is on bookshelves now, and Neil McRobert, host of none other than Talking Scared, the definitive podcast for horror authors out there. Um, and I'm saying this in all honesty because I do feel like what sets your work aside, there's the publishing, there's the things, the writing itself, but I don't know, like I feel like you two seem to be, from the outside looking in, giving a heck of a lot more than you're getting back. And I don't know. I guess I just want to start there and say that I am very grateful for both of you for the things that you do. I think Jump Scares, which is Emily's website, which if you have not heard of it, if you have not gone to it, you have to, because frankly, it is the definitive site for everything that is horror fiction related, genre related, that will end up on the bookshelves out there in the world on an annual rotating basis. And Emily, I mean, I'm just going to ask you, like, you're not doing this for money. You're not getting paid to do this, right? Like, this is just something that you do.
Yeah, I mean, with the caveat that as of last year, I started plugging in bookshop.org affiliate links on the big list of new releases. Just, in case someone buys the book through that link, I get a little, a little tip, basically. But other than that, no, I don't get paid for it. It is a for love of the game kind of thing.
God damn.
I really just, it was something that I needed. It was a resource that I was looking for and couldn't find. And so I decided to make it. And turns out it's really useful for other people too, which is like the light of my life to hear that, honestly. So I just keep doing it.
Yeah. Can you talk us through the kind of like origins of it? Like it started at, was it Nightfire?
Yeah.
Yeah. What were, is it that you were like, hey guys, we need to like do a website that like, or like, let's do postings for what's going on this year?
So way, way, way back in the day, I also used to run Penguin Random House's old sci-fi fantasy like consumer-facing site, which was called Unbound Worlds. And there I had a writer who every month would do, here's all the sci-fi fantasy coming this month. And he didn't do all of the books every month because that would have been prohibitive. But it was a good sort of overview of what was publishing. And those were consistently one of our best traffic drivers to the site because it was an SEO hit for like, new sci-fi books 2020, or 2015 at the time, I guess. But it was also just very useful to have around. And so when I started the Nightfire website, I thought, well, I'm going to do this for myself because I kept being surprised by books that were coming out, just when I thought I'd kind of gotten my arms around what was coming out in a given month or a given year, something would come out of left field and I'd be like, oh shit, I got to plan coverage for that. So I was doing it for myself. And then I thought, well, other people might find this useful too, because it's just not something that really exists on the internet. And sure enough, year over year, I've heard from booksellers, I've heard from podcasters, I've heard from librarians, I've heard from influencers and reviewers saying like, "Hey, this is a really valuable resource. Thank you so much." And at this point, I feel like I'm building up an archive of kind of contemporary horror fiction because I have these lists now dating all the way back to 2020. And it is a nice sort of year over year snapshot of what we've been doing, where we're going, what our sort of genre wide preoccupations are, what trends we're seeing. So, for that kind of like big picture angle alone, I find it really useful to go back and say, oh, what were we doing in 2022? What were we doing in 2020? Because publishing also moves at such a clip and really tends to focus only on new books, that having that discoverability for older books was really important for me too.
Yeah.
So hopefully it's working.
I mean, it is, and I'm almost a little, fearful for you because I feel as if what you've done is kind of put yourself in this position of being the kind of the person who is now responsible for, keeping tabs and or chronicling and like, do you say like when it's December, I don't know, November, I don't know when you start kind of compiling, but is there just that moment where you take a deep breath and you say to yourself, like, oh my God, I have to do it again?
Um, so yes, but I've mitigated that by starting the list in like June of the previous year.
Hmm.
As soon as I hear about something, publishing in the subsequent year, I'm like, that's going on the spreadsheet. So I just have a running spreadsheet. And then usually in August or September, I'll start actually plugging titles into a draft on my website. So I'm just doing it progressively. I'm doing it, a month or two at a time. Makes it easier. It also just works with the publishing landscape because I published my 2025 list last week, so very beginning of December. There are still, I would, that list is at over 300 titles now. I'm guessing, we'll easily hit 450 or 500 next year because a lot of the books in the last 4 to 5, excuse me, 4 to 5 months of the year have not even been announced yet. So I can't include them because I don't know about them. So these things, come in waves and they come in on kind of a rolling basis. And so I just decided to adapt to that, and that's how I do it.
Yeah. Um, I just I just want to repeat that number. 450 books, horror books. Not not we're not talking all the books. We're just talking this one shelf. Like 450 horror books will you you forecast will come out in 2025.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. We had 550 that were on my list, and I still miss things. I'm not perfect. I don't have an algorithm for this. It's, human, so it's trial and error. But yeah, 550 in 2024 is an
Five.
insane number. It's
Yeah.
completely unhinged. And a lot of that is I've gotten better at finding small press titles, or small presses have gotten better at finding me, which is also great. And that's really broadened the landscape of what I'm including on the list. But yeah, it's just year over year, the growth has been really incredible to watch.
Yeah. Um, I complete sidebar. It was really kind of exciting because you posted the list, I guess, earlier this week or last week, but within the week you posted it, everybody started sharing it, and it was like this, in these kind of social media landscapes, like it was really exciting to see people be like, in their personal posts, be like, I'm so honored, and my book is on this list, and like it's like a place to go to. It's like a, I don't know, like a destination, and I thought that was really kind of touching. And you're doing that. um but I'm still kind of like gobsmacked by the number 450, because do you know how many of those Neil has to read to get to next year?
TikTok man.
Oh,
Neil, I I gotta say, I remember, I mean, Paul Tremblay was your first guest on
yeah.
Talking Scared, yeah?
Mhm.
So, we all have podcasts. Like we're all like, I'm gonna start a podcast. Like I'm gonna do an interview show and get amazing horror authors on. I want to get Paul Tremblay. Like, yeah, we all want Mr. Tremblay on our shows. I don't know anyone who's ever gotten Paul Tremblay for their very, very first episode of their unknown, under the radar, no listenership podcast. So I guess I just want to start by saying, how did you do that?
I don't know. Yeah, he got 208 downloads that month. I remember that was the total sum of downloads in month one, and I think most of them were my family.
It's a big
Basically,
family,
I
right?
I had never interviewed anybody before that first episode ever. I had no experience in I did any of it. But I had spoken to him once a few years earlier, and I can't remember how. But for some reason, when I wasn't a reviewer and I wasn't a journalist, I wasn't anything, Titan sent me one of his books, and I said, "Can I speak to him for a magazine?" And I tried to pitch it, and I sold the interview for like $15, and Paul spoke to me then. So then when I had this idea, I just thought, well, I have one contact, and I wrote to Paul, and he said, yeah, but I don't know why he said yeah. I wouldn't say yeah. Like, do your due diligence, man. And then he gave me John Langan's email address, and the rest was history.
Oh
But it was
God.
just because Paul is kind.
Yeah. Well, we all are kind of aware of his kindness, but what's interesting is that you definitely took it from there, and it became, I mean, Talking Scared has quite literally become this kind of depot for readers. Yeah, yeah. I mean, like you get amazing authors on. Like there's no denying it. But what, like, never fail, anytime I'm doing an event somewhere, and it doesn't matter where, it is inevitable that one person, if not two or three people, will come up and say, "Hey, I listened to that, your episode on Talking Scared," and it's just, it's kind of, I don't know, like it's, that doesn't happen often, and I guess I want to speak to the alchemy of your podcast, because I sincerely believe that, like, people come to it, if not to you, in order to, like, find their next book. Like, what are we going to read? And there's great value in that. There's like a huge responsibility to that. Not to put any pressure on your shoulders, but like it is kind of awe-inspiring to, I don't know, just see it kind of like have happened organically over the course of, like, what, 3 years now? Has it been
4 years. It was 4 years in
4 years?
September.
God.
Yeah.
So why you, man?
Oh, Christ, what a question to ask me. Ask anybody but me. I don't know. I think, if I'm honest, I think being British helps because, like, most of my audience are American.
Uh-huh.
And I think this accent, which where I live is a marker of idiocy. You guys don't hear that, right? So I think that carries some novelty value, maybe. I think basically, look, there's the academic stuff, so I can bring a little bit of that. I've got a little bit of, stuff to say that perhaps isn't run of the mill, but I try not to overdo that. Um, I'm enthusiastic, I suppose. I sometimes wonder, and this is not to in any way condemn other podcasts, because I'm sure they all do the same thing, but I know of some that don't. Um, I read every word of every book, and I think not so much podcasts, but I read a lot of journalism where they've not read the book. You can tell they've not
Hmm.
read the book. I read every word of every book, even the books I don't like, I finish, you know. And if I don't, I admit it on the episode. And I think that adds a texture, perhaps, and some substance to the. But I don't know, man. It's a silly question to ask me. I don't know why me. If I knew that, I'd sell it, but I don't, you know.
Well, in the spirit of giving back, like, I mean, there must be a sense of engagement, like the conversations that you're having with these authors. Like, I
Mm.
do believe that, like, you're coming at it from an angle where, yes, you've read the book, which is always a great place to start, but it's the conversation that you're having kind of beyond that. And you know, your kind of like education, your kind of like schooling, was it always kind of leading towards journalism? Was this the kind of the path, like?
It led mostly towards the precipice of a nervous breakdown. But no, yeah, I always thought I'd be an academic. That was always the plan.
Mhm.
I had no other transferable skills of any kind. I can't wire a plug, mate. I don't know how to do anything. Thankfully, my wife's trained to be an engineer, so she takes care of all the things that matter. But I always thought I'd be an academic, and then I did all that stuff, and I found out I hated it. Um, so I left that and just floundered. And then I thought basically the one thing I have a genuine love for is I won't even say books, I'll say stories. Like stories are the most important thing in my life. Everything I care about in the world has a story attached to it. That's how I think. It's how I operate in terms of story and narrative. It's a really good way of saying you're a born liar. But but so I always wanted to be a writer, and that seemed like a pipe dream because I was one of those writers who talked a lot about writing and never wrote a damn thing, you know. And then I quit my job in the pandemic, became a white male cliche, started a podcast, and have just found my work ethic late in life. I found the thing that I'll happily stay up till midnight and talk to you guys. I'll happily work all day in a thing that pays me almost nothing because I just love it, you know. And there's indirect rewards with other stuff I get paid for as a kind of knock-on consequence of the podcast. And I've got some very generous Patreon listeners. But like Emily says, we're not doing this for the money. It's just I always wanted to work with story. And that I think is what everything, not just my learning, but my entire life led to.
Yeah, which kind of brings us to here now, 2024.
Mhm.
And I think that, Emily, I'm imagining, like, just off camera, there are just reams and reams of these archives. You know, they're not digital, like they're all kind of like within some sort of binder. Um, but it's really interesting to hear you say, like, once you kind of started this process with jump scares, that you have the ability to, I don't know if you have, but the kind of like opportunity to kind of look back and see where we were in 2020, 2021, 2022. So I guess my question to you is, uh, with the cheat sheet of history, um, how has horror evolved this year? Like, what was, could you see a kind of marked difference between where we were in 2023 to 2024?
When you get that granular, when you're talking about, one year versus the next, the changes are much more minor. The differences it's mostly differences in trends. Last year we were seeing a lot of horror westerns. We were seeing a lot of vampire stories. This year we had kind of more of a slasher, the continuing slasher revival, a lot of sort of beauty horror, motherhood horror, grief horror, that kind of thing. And then, when you kind of zoom out and you start to see how things have changed over time, you start to see certain moments. Like I think the publication of Stephen Graham Jones' The Only Good Indians was a huge one because it showed Big Five publishing speculative imprints that yes, like horror really was a viable commercial product for them to sell. And that, diverse voices especially were something that was going to sell, and something that people were really clamoring for. And watching kind of if you really get granular with it, like the increase year over year in indigenous and native horror, it's just blossomed. And that's been true of a lot of like sort of really niche demographics, niche subgenres. The broadening of the field and the broadening of the publishing landscape has opened up a lot of opportunities for there not just to be, let's say, there's like one folk horror person, there's like
Mm.
one cosmic horror person. It's like, no, everybody gets to play in these sandboxes. And that's really kind of beautiful. Like Neil, I also get very, very sentimental about the power of stories. And seeing that has been just really gratifying. And, I know there was some chatter this year, more in the film space than in the fiction space, like, oh, is the horror bubble gonna burst? And A, no. Short answer. B, I think that's reductive. I think, what we're seeing is also horror becoming so many different things, like this genre blend that's taking place. There's a lot of just like pure straight down the middle horror out there, but there's a lot of romantic horror. There's a lot of mystery horror. There's a lot of sci-fi horror. There's a lot of sort of, literary horror. I'm scare quotes, very much intended. Um, and I think that kind of genre blending is where the really interesting stuff happens because you're getting this like cross-pollination from two different modes of storytelling. This year, I think a lot about House of Bone and Rain by Gabino Iglesias or A Mask of Flies by Matt Lyons as sort of this like really intense, high octane crime horror thriller style of storytelling, which is something that you wouldn't necessarily have found 5 years ago, or it would have been a lot harder to find.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that sort of like growing, shifting, morphing has been a really beautiful thing to see.
Neil, I mean, with talking scared, like, I mean, you're speaking to a pretty wide, broad kind of range of authors, and like, do you find that it's shifting? Like, are the authors that you are speaking to, like, it's not the same group that it was in 2022, I have to imagine. Like, it's changing.
It is, yeah. It's evolving more than changing because we're not losing people, we're gaining people, right? So it's like this snowball, this pitch black snowball.
Mhm.
And there's a couple of things about that because on the one hand, you have certain years where it feels like everyone is published at the same time. So you have years, I'm really bad at years. Emily's the person for this. Like I get mixed up what came out when, right? But you'll have years where Tremblay and Grady Hendrix and Stephen Graham Jones and Malaman have books out. And then you and Nat Cassidy and Rachel Harrison have a book out every year, right? But there are years where like what we would call the big names don't have books out because they all seem to be on this same trajectory. And what I'm noticing now is on those what would have been fallow years, it doesn't feel like there's an absence because there's enough new people coming through year on year and establishing themselves. Like Phil Fracassi now feels like a big deal when he has a book coming out, and it feels like there's always somebody coming through attaining that next level. So every year feels stuffed, whereas it would have felt like a very binary on-off sort of situation with the big names, then not the big names, not that long ago. And it feels like it's really just filled up the space. And the other thing is, like Emily mentioned about, the idea that there is one of this and one of that, and one person does this. I remember in my third ever episode, I spoke to Sylvia Moreno Garcia, who wrote Mexican Gothic, and we had a quite difficult conversation about there can be only oneism of publishing. And this was back in 2020, so not a million years ago, and how she had been seemingly plucked as right, okay, we have a Mexican horror writer now. Or not even Mexican, we have
We have a woman of color.
we have a
Yeah.
woman of color or a Latin horror writer. I mean, that would be ludicrous now. You look at who, the people writing books now, and it's expanded so much the field in every possible, niche community or however you want to describe it, you know. So I really think that's obviously a positive thing because it takes the burden off that one writer to speak for everyone, which is must be horrendous. And also we get this rich tapestry of story, which sounds really cheesy to say, but like I say, I'm sentimental about stories, so I'm going to be cheesy. So that's the thing. It's just filling up the space, man. There's never a dull week. There's never a week on my podcast where I couldn't have minimum 5, 6, 10 authors, you know, easy.
Yeah.
Never a week where I struggle.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
it's
Emily, you say that, we want to kind of like steer away from this
sorry,
notion.
cat.
You just get attacked by a cat. That's amazing.
I've sent Ted to bed.
Jump
Perfect.
scare. Yeah, I was gonna ask, like, okay, you say we're not gonna say bubble, but I want to kind of express a certain anxiety that I have, which is that within this kind of expansion, uh, how, you know, is there like, are we reaching critical mass? Like, is there a saturation point, or is it that like, you know, this writer has this many readers, or is it just, I don't know where, I'm not going to say bubble, but I want to ask, like suggest, like, is there some sort of implosive moment where it collapses on itself?
My my concern along those lines is less about horror as a genre kind of imploding or, the bottom falling out of the market. My concern is more about just the overall state of book publishing right now. I
Mhm.
think that is more likely to be a factor that is significant in the coming years. Not to be a pessimist, but like if I hear one more big five publisher talk about AI, I'm just really I'm going to end up on the news. Like it's bad. It's not a fun time. But this is kind of true of corporate art in really like every realm. And I mean, Clay, I'm sure with the film worlds, that you have to deal with the David Zaslavs of the world, right? Saying
Mhm.
like, no, we're not going to renew Sesame Street. The issue is really like the greed and the drive for the impossibility that is infinite growth that you get at sort of the top of the business model. And I think a lot of what counteracts that is people publishing with, teeny tiny indie presses, is people self-publishing, is people diversifying their publishing models. If you look at Haley Piper or Eric LaRocca, they're publishing a lot and they're publishing in a lot of different formats, story collections, novellas, novels at a bunch of different publishers. And I'm not saying like that is the one way to do it, right? It is a way to do it. It doesn't work for everyone, especially people who don't write that fast.
Mhm.
Um, but I don't know, there are a lot of factors at play here, and I don't think my instinct is that like the public's desire to read fucked up scary books is not going to be the thing that like fails first.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I? Because we've never reached the saturation point with crime fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And is that because there's like a steady hunger for it? Like the marketplace kind of dictates that, like, how much they kind of
Mhm.
turn the spigot. So with crime fiction, like it's a steady clip because there's just enough readers for it. Like,
Yeah, but
um,
also fantasy. Fantasy's been back since I would say the early 90s. I mean, I'm not an expert in publishing at all. Emily knows far more than me, as she does on most things. I described myself to Jamie as I described myself as Igor to your Victor Frankenstein. Um, but you know, fantasy came back in a big way and hasn't gone away. I can't talk about margins and what authors get paid, but the demand for it is still there. And crime. I mean, you go in. I don't know what it might be different in the UK, but you go in any British bookstore, and like it is just awash with crime titles, which may all be very, very idiosyncratic, but have essentially the same cover.
yeah,
And there's never any sense of any kind of squeezing of the demand or contraction.
yeah,
Well, I think also if we look at romance as a genre, I think that can be kind of instructive because there's been also a huge boom in romance publishing over the last 5, 6, 7 years. And at first that was like straight up and down, like happily ever after romance. And now there's this huge surge in I hate this portmanteau so much, romantasy, which is exactly what it sounds like. No knock on the books, I just hate the word. And I kind of wonder because that it's that same like sort of genre blending cross pollination I was talking about earlier, and I kind of wonder if we're going to see that like romance creep into horror because we have like there's a lot of erotic horror out there, and it's even starting to come from mainstream publishers. I mean, look at C.J. Lee, look at Haley Piper, who has a like kink-inspired King in Yellow reimagining coming next year from a Big Five publisher. Any Eric LaRocca book, you know.
Sarah Gailey's Spread Me. Have you seen that one?
Yes. Oh my
Like,
God.
yeah.
That title, I saw it and I like gasped aloud. Um, so I think yeah, romance is another thing where like the hardcore fans kept the genre alive for a long time, and now it's, you know, it's having a moment, it's in the mainstream. But I think both romance and horror are kind of two sides of the same coin, which is escapism. Uh, you know, there are people who have to look away from the big scary thing, and there are people who have to look right at it. And horror fans, I think, tend to be people who want to look right at it, and romance fans might want to look away from it. And that's totally fine. There's no moral value judgment on either of those. But I think, you know, people always experience love and lust, and they always experience fear and uncertainty. Like that's just how the world works. So I don't think that hunger really. I think the forms it takes, absolutely, those ebb and flow and have trends, but the underlying drive for those kinds of stories, I don't think really goes away ever.
Yeah. Um, I mean, you bring up a really interesting point, and it's that idea. Yeah, I feel as if I could say that 2024 was a pretty intense year for a lot of different reasons. Um, and I think I could even say that the last 5 years, the last 8 years have been pretty intense. Regardless of who you are and where you are, like that, these are some very charged times that we're living in. And it is it has been said that horror as a market does extremely well when there is like the horrors of the world that we see outside our window. Uh, Somehow, for some reason, that kind of drives readers to the horror shelf at the bookstore, and I I feel like 2024 was a year amongst many recently where this has been kind of stated. So, Neil, I'm kind of curious. Like, do you feel as if horror has a need that is somehow kind of indicative or reflective of where we are as a culture, as a world? Is this a global issue? Is this a Barnes and Noble issue? I don't know.
Well, I mean, you basically wrote the book that proves your thesis, right? So wake up and open your eye. I mean, it is essentially like the world's current anxieties in book form. So yes. So I mean, you can get wiggy on this one and go back in history, and like there's a lot of talk that horror dropped off after the Second World War. It's not true. They just didn't call it horror for like 30 years, but people still wrote ghost stories. You know, Shirley Jackson became Queen. Um, Weird Tales flourished. You know, all of that stuff. So it carried on. Um, I think there's the cliched thing about people needing to. When I say cliched, I don't think it's untrue, but it's oft stated that people need controllable fear in their lives. That they go to well, for example, you know, in the Great Depression, that you know, people flocked to see the Universal monster movies because it was a manageable fear that was fun, rather than oh my God, I'm in a tent and I can't feed my kids. Um, so there's that, which I think is true. I think with what's currently going on, I don't know how it's going to map because this feels like such an existential crisis for the world in terms of our reality seems becoming unfrayed. Um, I don't want to get into it. We all know what we're talking about, but there's a million permutations of it. The way that life as we know it seems to be changing on a dime. Um, I think horror will respond to it. I just don't know how, because I don't know how you find either a microcosmic metaphor or a macrocosmic exaggeration for what's going on. How do you like some of the global trauma right now and the sense of how adrift we are? How do you miniaturize that to a human story or maximize it to like a Stephen King-esque epic? I don't know because it already feels so grandiose. So I'm interested. I don't think it will harm horror. I think it will potentially force horror to be really bold and go for some really, really big swings. And we've already noticed that in 2024, like horror's getting wackier, and it's getting more, I won't say splatterpunk. It's not getting more extreme necessarily in terms of its severity, but it's getting more extreme in terms of the grandiosity of its ideas. I mean, you know, not since Poppy Z. Bright stopped publishing has anyone like CJ Lee come along and written a novel about a nationwide sex zombie rampage. That is a thing that last existed in the early 90s. So it feels like big swings are coming to try and find some way to reflect the fucking nightmare around us. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Do you think that it will be supported? Like, it's
Oh
terrifying to
yeah.
think of a big swing because if you whiff, it's, you know, you
Oh, come on, man. You're like every book of yours is a big swing. I'm not saying this to be nice to you, but every book of yours is like
this is
high
not about
concept.
me, man. This is about the world. I'm talking about the world out there. The world, the state of publishing as it is. Don't use me
Uh,
as the microcosm.
oh,
Think of the
I do,
children.
Clay. I do, Clay. You're my template for how it all works. Um, no, I think it's of course it'll be supported. I think people always want new stories, right? And I think what we've got that's really interesting. Emily was saying about how you've got these sort of genre blends and genre portmanteaus, and how stuff's happening at the interstitial between genres. We've almost got horror is now like a series of satellites without a star to orbit. Because King, let's face it, King is King, but King's books, release by release, are no longer the epochal events they once were.
Mhm.
He exists as this like elder god, but book by book, they're not hitting as hard as they not because nothing is because we live in this algorithmic, compartmentalized cultural universe that with our Spotify playlists and stuff like that. So nothing hits like that anymore. But it feels like the stuff in the 80s with the big boys of horror, that's the center of the universe. And you used to have these, you'd have, I don't know, Poppy Z. Bright and other people whose names I can't think of right now, orbiting it, Kathy Koja and people like that. It feels like now it's all satellites doing their own weird little geometries in space, the
Mhm.
non-Euclidean arcs, out around the back of Saturn, and there's nothing in the middle to anchor it. And rather than that being a bad thing, I think it's a great thing. I think it's just because cool stuff happens in chaos. That's where the cool shit comes from. So the
Mhm.
more I'm going on a real kind of like astronomical metaphor here, but the more you unanchor things from a central gravity and just let things spin off, yeah, of course that's great. And people will go with their author and they may not read this over here at ever,
Mhm.
but they'll read that and they'll read the three people who are kind of doing the mini orbit of that, and I think that's amazing. And that's a way to harness this mad algorithmic ghettoized culture. Find your niche
Mhm.
and kind of, really can commit to it. And that's a
Yeah.
great thing.
Yeah, I think what we're kind of talking around here is the end of monoculture.
Hmm.
There is not any longer like this is the TV show that everyone is watching on the night that it airs. It's the only thing they're talking
Yeah.
about at the office tomorrow. I mean, that's not how the world works anymore. That's not how streaming works. That's not how, I could talk about that for a long time. But also, I wanted to bring up that when I was at Merrimack Halloween Book Fest this year, I had a conversation with John Langan that was fascinating. Where and he's just like he's the nicest guy, and he's also intimidatingly brilliant. Um,
Horrors of Uncular Uncle, as I like to call him.
exactly, exactly. And we started talking about the importance of bringing in influences from outside horror. And he just kind of spun off this like off the cuff, like, oh, well, and uh, Paul Tremblay reads a lot of Roberto Bolaño and Stephen Graham Jones. And I was just like, oh, okay, sure. You've got a thesis just like top of mind at all times. But something that he said that really stuck with me was, this is true of pretty much any genre, but horror writers who only read horror, like if that's the ecosystem, it's not necessarily on like a writer by writer basis, but if that's the ecosystem in which horror fiction is trying to flourish, then it's just going to turn into this weird kind of inbred
Hmm.
like homunculus. You have to bring in other influences, other modes of storytelling, other ways of prose writing, other like formal, experiments from other places, not just in fiction, but in the rest of the creative world and, film and TV and art and music. And that's how you keep a healthy ecosystem going. And that's really that I've been thinking about that for like 3 months now.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, I still crave those water cooler moments. And every now and again, you will get a book that comes out that brings everyone together in the mass celebration. That's a beautiful thing. And it's a lovely Darwinistic thing, because you just found that sweet spot of the zeitgeist of the moment. And that's lovely. And I'm not saying I want everyone to be in their own little enclave and never at all. But it's nice that when you with the lessening gravity of those big connective books, it's nice that that frees up, I think, more creative chaos. That's all I'm saying. I think you can have
Yeah.
both.
No, I agree.
Totally.
And I do feel like, thinking in terms of the end of monoculture and that like there isn't the water cooler show for us to kind of speak about, but that there is like occasionally the one that like bubbles up and like we
Mhm.
all I I feel like what you then do is what the two of you specifically do is create constellations. Like there's a satellite over here, there's a satellite over here, a star, a star, a star. You are now drawing the lines that connect those kind of disparate elements, those elements to one another in order to create a larger view for the rest of us to look at. So, you know, it's you guys doing a lot of the legwork. And so I'm going to put you on both of you on the spot and ask like who are the other satellites that I'm not paying attention to? Like who's over there on the other side of the galaxy that I'm not aware of? Like if I had to ask you to name a handful, one or two or three like authors that it's like I am going to campaign that these are the writers that you need to know about because I don't think enough people know about them, or I don't know that the pocket over there knows about the pocket over there. Like, um, and I'm going to vamp for just a second so that you can brainstorm, because one of the moments that I personally saw kind of happen, Neil, which I really loved, was the kind of discovery of this young gent by the name of Chris Panettiere, in his book, The Redemption of Morgan Bright.
Yeah,
Chris is like, I think he's like 3 books in now, 4 books. Like
yeah.
I know he's continuing to write, but like, um, you know, he's not someone that people knew of, and you take a risk and then you advocate. You say, I want you, world, to know about this author. And like that in of itself has such immense value, and I feel like that is not something that can be uh paola'd. We want that kind of pay it forward altruism, and where you can't, like you say, these are the authors that I want you to know about. You have to read this book. Have you read this book? No, you got to read this book. So that was my vamp, and I'm using Chris as an example because I saw, him get kind of ushered in by you, and like you've advocated for him. So you can't use him as an example. Sorry.
He was one of my first three examples.
Done.
So the two that come straight to mind, and other people will occur to me, and then I'll feel really bad about it. But the two people that come to mind are Tyler Jones and LP Hernandez, both of whom are working in smaller presses, both of whom came to my attention through short story collections, which I'm often a little bit more reticent to cover on the show because it's much harder to have a conversation that flows with a series of short stories, than it is about a novel. And Tyler came with a big fat blurb from Chuck Palahniuk, who is, a hero of mine. So I thought, fair enough. And he came on, he had a series, a short story collection called Burn the Plans. I think this was 2022, maybe 2020. Yeah, 2022. And it blew me away. Just cap and sorry, I'll make this simple because I'll talk about LP and then connect them. LP Hernandez is had a big year this year. He had a novella called In the Way of the Headless Men, which is a weird Jeff Vandermeer-esque slipstreamy type novella, but with more heart. Anything that involves people going into weird zones, I call Jeff Vandermeer-esque because it's my only frame of reference. But then he followed up with a collection called No Gods, Only Chaos, which just delighted me. And they both, Tyler's collection and LP's, for the same reason. They have a wonderful grasp of voice. Characters, like LP is an ex-Marine, and he's writing about like perspective of like three young girls living in a trailer park in the desert, and it's so authentic. And Tyler's writing about like art dealers and these two like feral brothers living in the woods, who killed their father. And it just feels so authentic. And that's the key thing to me. And the other thing, and I've said this about both books separately, and I'll say it here simultaneously, is that reading them felt like when I first found King through reading Night Shift, in that every story was completely different to the next, but they had a connective tissue of like genuine nightmarish horror, but it was never less than fun. They never navel gaze. They never get lost in how beautiful their prose is. They fucking tell the story and they adorn it just enough. And they get on with it and they move you in like 12 pages. But a movement, you can cry, you can laugh, you can howl, you can snigger, you can cringe. I just think they are both. If we live in a just universe, they are bound for full and rewarding careers.
Well, there you go. Emily, who are you going to advocate for? Who do you need to like tell like us that we need to read?
I mean, I have a lot of these because this is kind of my like, I don't know, I used to be a bookseller and this was my like, nobody needs my help to find Stephen King, right? But they might need my help to find Scott Hawkins or Alison Rumfitt or, so I have a lot of sort of like, oh, you like this top level book, I say top level, I mean like this big known book or author, you should read these lesser known. It's really, really hard to pick. I want to say first and foremost, probably Caitlin Starling. She operates in like a genre-y, slipstreamy, kind of throw it all at the wall space. So she doesn't always get classified as horror, but like the horror elements in her books are so, so, so good. I started with her on her first book, The Luminous Dead, which is an incredibly claustrophobic, like cave diving on an extraterrestrial planet that is one of the most just like psychologically fucked up things I've ever read. It's such a great book. And she has this ability to write these like despicably disturbing scenes and characters and relationships and then have them like drop these one-liners that have me rolling, which is it's hard to balance horror and humor like that. Another one is Ai Jiang. Lincoln, her novella was my first, and it was one of those, as I was talking earlier about genre cross-pollination, the closest analog I can think of to her work in that novella is honestly George Saunders, and that's not a comparison I make lightly. Sort of a beautiful take on haunted houses and grief and like home ownership that I had just never, it just was totally, totally novel to me. And yeah, I think she's wonderful. I think Elizabeth Hand is, people in the genre space do know her, but I think she deserves to be much, much, much better known. I mean, Wilding Hall is one of those books that I'm always trying to shove into people's hands. Who else? Andrew Michael Hurley, like criminally underread on this side of the Atlantic. I love everything he has written. He is a modern master of folk horror, and I really wish someone in the U.S. would pick him up because his latest book is a short story collection where all the stories take place in the same fictional town, which is a conceit that I absolutely love. And they start in the sort of prehistory, the town's founding, and it moves forward through time chronologically from there, and ends in like the 2040s with this sort of like grim dystopian, denouement. And yeah, I want more from him. I want him to be better known. And then I would say Maddie Lubchansky. My graphic novels not always my milieu, but I will read anything Maddie writes. They wrote a graphic novel called Boys Weekend about sort of the experience of being gender nonconforming and still being friends with the people who knew you before you were out. And it's like this very nuanced and touching story that is set against this banana pants bonkers cosmic horror like near future dystopian story, and it's just such a blast. And they have a new one coming out next summer, and I'm just never going to stop talking about them.
Yeah.
Can I just say two more, Clay, before I forget? I'll be very
No,
quick.
you're cut off. You're done. You had to.
I'm just going to talk over you. Um, Gemma Amor, who is a full disclosure,
Yeah.
a very good friend of mine, and lots of people know Gemma, but I never know who knows who from in terms of British authors. Gemma's one of the hardest working writers I know, and Jesus Christ, she can write like the acuity of disturbed female minds better than, well, most people. And the other one, completely new writer to me, but I read her what may have been her debut book, and it blew me away. And that's a writer called Kaylee Pedersen,
Oh
who
my God,
wrote
yes. Yeah.
wrote a book last year called, sorry, was it this year came out?
It's this year, Sacrificial
This year.
Animals.
Sacrifice.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And everyone knows that I don't like books that are about animal cruelty. This is a book that hinges on a act of animal cruelty and then becomes this like rich American Gothic. And if you've seen the movie Minari about the Korean family taking over the farm in Nebraska or somewhere, imagine like a brutal Cormac McCarthy-esque, violent, epic version of that. And that's what that book is. Sacrificial Animals. It's one of the best books I've read all year.
Wow. Um, you two are actually futurists, and you have this ability, this uncanny knack to kind of look into the future. And I see you both kind of like in the crystal ball of 2025 and saying this is the next evolutionary phase. This is the next step. Um, I I feel like you've given us a good roster of new authors to read. But I'm curious about trends. And it's not so much that it's, vampires are hot. I what is it that you want to see? Like where do you want
Hmm.
horror to go? It's, not market tested, not, like but like where it's a new year, it's a new dawn. Like where can we take this genre that feels like it's going to forge ahead and not sidestep or backstep? Easy peasy.
I I I think it's already happening. And I've written on this and I've talked about it a fair bit. So sorry if I'm repeating myself from other shows. But I I got very tired of irony. And I got very tired of postmodernism. That's what all of my sort of research history was in, the postmodernist moment in horror. And I got tired of the screamification of horror, and that everything is self-recursive and all that. But there are some people who do it so well, right? So I don't ever want to tell Stephen Graham Jones to stop interrogating tropes. I don't ever want to tell Grady Hendrix to stop interrogating tropes. But I think what I want to happen and what is already happening is that people, the really skillful writers, are finding a way to continue this interrogation and this tussle with the genre without the critical distance that makes the genre cold. I'll put it a simpler way. They are managing to marry the head and the heart. They're managing to tell stories that are self-aware sometimes, not overtly so maybe, but self-aware and critical and all that stuff. But they have characters that feel real and you care about them, and they're not pieces on an intellectual game board. Jay Daniels, case in point. You know what I mean? And I think I want more of that. And I also, a quicker answer, I want more maximalist horror. I want more stories. I want CJ Leeds' American Rapture, but I want the 800-page version.
Can you imagine if there's like the director's cut of
Oh my
American
God.
Rapture? Did she leave anything on the cutting room floor? Like, I can't imagine.
It was, if she did, it was sticky.
Oof.
I just went right back to that restaurant bathroom.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Oh, Emily, what's in the future? What do we see? What do we see? What do we want? What do we need?
I mean, okay, so I'm with Neil. I think we're very aligned on this, where increasingly for me, like the best compliment I can give to a work of art is that it's fun. And I don't mean fun in like, oh, it's trivial and I laughed it off. I mean fun in like, oh, this like gets my blood pumping, and it can be fucked up or sad or scary or disturbing, and that can still be fun because I read horror. That's what we're here for. Like I'm watching Black Doves right now, which is a spy miniseries on Netflix. And it's fun. And I'm like, oh, this has a sense of humor. It's not that it's full of jokes. It's not that prescriptive, right? It's like there was some joy involved in making it. That's what I'm
Yeah.
looking for. Joy and like interest in the craft, right? And this is one of the reasons that like I will never read anything written by an AI, because I'm like, there was no joy in that. There was no care, there was no humor, there was no soul. That's what I read for. That's what I go to stories for. I want to see the inside of somebody else's head. And I think there were a couple good examples of this year. And I mean, Rachel Harrison's always a prime example of this for me. Is like, these are fun books, while still dealing with heady topics and like horrible violence and death. This year for me, it was Diavola by Jennifer Thorne as well, which was such a fun fucking book. I was like, this is like, it's giving me everything. It's giving me a main character who's interesting and like kind of a hot mess. It's giving me her family who all suck. It's giving me this like really like surprisingly deep and layered sort of ghost story mystery. And it's giving me an ending that I found both deeply satisfying and surprising.
Yeah.
And there are a couple coming out next year that I've already read that kind of hit that same blend for me. One is Victorian Psycho by Victoria Fato, which I'm going to be shouting about for months. So just like get used to it now. Which is a short novel about a Victorian, oh my God, I'm blanking on the word. She minds children.
Governess.
Nanny?
Governess, thank you.
That's the Brit.
Yeah. You have to know that. That's in the DNA. A governess who takes a job minding two horrible children at a stately home, and it becomes very apparent that the governess herself is profoundly damaged and disturbed and violent and scary, and the whole thing is told from her point of view, and it's like, oh, it's just written with the same sense of like verve and meanness that you find in like Paul Tremblay's work, especially horror movie. And then Listen to Your Sister by Nina Veal, which also I think comes out in March. It's a debut novel about a trio of black siblings, and the eldest, the sister, has to take care of her 17-year-old brother, who is not making it easy. And it becomes about sort of parentification and resentment and, Black Lives Matter, police violence against Black people. But it's also like funny and sharp, and it has these really lived in sibling relationships. And that's kind of what I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but like I'm looking for the whole picture, I'm looking for the whole
Mhm.
package. I want it to be firing on all cylinders. And
Yeah.
then in terms of like a micro trend, there are two things that I wanted to mention. The first is there's kind of this focus I'm starting to see on modern technology and exactly what it's doing to us and enabling us to do to each other. And Clay, of course, you've got Wake Up and Open Your Eyes. There's also Wrecked by Alex Gonzalez. Um,
That book
there's
Wrecked. I mean,
I'm
someone's
scared of
gonna
that book.
someone's gonna blurb it and say wrecked me because that book is traumatizing. My
Yeah.
God, that
Oh,
book.
oh,
there's
good.
a Polybius by Colin Armstrong and Feeders by Matt Serafini. So I think it's
Mhm.
interesting that these are all men writing these stories of sort of, as we see in real world, the very real problem of radicalization of young men on the internet. So that's a trend that I'm kind of keeping an eye on. And then there's a silly one, which is that there are three books coming out in 2025 that share a title convention. The first is How to Survive a Slasher by Justine Purcell Winans, comes out in March. The second is How to Survive a Horror Story by Mallory Arnold, comes out in July. The third is How to Survive Camping, The Man with No Shadow by Bonnie Quinn, which is out in August. And that just made me laugh, so I thought I'd share it.
There's going to be a fourth added, and it's How to Survive an Interview with Clay, which I think the two of you have done with aplomb, and I can't thank you enough. Neil, I'm looking at the time, and poor Neil is staying up way past his bedtime across the pond to have this conversation with us. So I want to be mindful of Betty Bye. But I want to ask one last question to the two of you. And do you still have hope? Like, is there still like hope in horror? Like, are you hopeful? Like, is there like the drive in the morning to like, I'm gonna read some spooky stuff today. Or I'm gonna write spooky stuff. Do you do you feel the forward push?
Emily?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I wake up, I have honestly, it's my way of coping with like the dread the rest of the time is like, yeah, I mean, that thing about having like safe frights is very real for me as a very anxious person. I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna sit down and I'm gonna read something that has like a resolution and I have some sense of control over it. And that is going to make me feel better because it's just going to kind of soothe my nervous system a little bit. But also, I wake up in the morning and pour myself a cup of coffee and I sit down with a horror book because it's fun and I love it. And that, like, if that's not hope, I don't know what is.
I have hope for horror and I have hope for the world. And I think it will all be fine, which is a silly thing to say because, of course, it won't all be fine. But I do believe that all the things we are currently terrified of will not kill us. Um, and this thing I've said a million times and it's becoming kind of ad nauseum, but good horror is very, very rarely about the scary thing. It's about the people who come together to stand against the scary thing. That's what these books are really about. Um, and I think that is a reason to hope in stories and in life. And if that sounds trite, I don't care because I genuinely mean it. I think it will be okay.
Yeah.
I
Um,
think just not just to put a button on that. Yeah, I think the thing that gives me hope is that people still have stories and want to tell them.
Mhm.
oh, we're gonna be sitting around the campfire when all the power grids are shut down, and
Mhm.
we'll still be spinning some yarns. I think, I hope, I believe. I'm really sincere when I say this. I see the work that you two are kind of independently doing and it really means a lot. And I don't know. I hope you know that. I don't know. Like I hope that like you're aware. Like this is I want to give you a pat on the back because I think that people need it. Writers need it, readers need it. Like I think that there is you know, this whole sense of like what is the horror community that I feel like I am aware of on some kind of peripheral level via all of our apps and social media. I the only thing that makes it feel uh, real to me beyond screen time is when someone says, "I read this book, I love this book, you should read this book," and you two have been the go-tos for me to find out what I'm going to read next. And I have a new list, so I can't thank you enough. So yeah, everybody, this has been Emily C. Hughes, Neil McRobert. I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. This is our final episode of 2024. We'll hopefully see you in 2025. Thank you very much, guys. This has been Fearmongers. It's going to cut off any second now.